Connie about this. When I saw the write-up on the Facebook page, and maybe it was a little bit different, and she kind of changed it a little bit and talked about the happy endings. I don't know that I really have a lot of happy endings today. I do have one at the end, but otherwise it's just, talks about the tragedy. And these are all from quite a few years ago. So I guess if this is a family member you recognize, if you want to raise your hand, if you want to share anything as we go along. Okay, so this first one, when I told Bonnie what I was doing, she said, "Oh, do you have the one about where the lady had gotten burnt?" And I said, she was going to try and come up with the name for me, and then in the meantime I talked to Don Whitworth, and of course then, just giving him an idea about it, and he knew the name right away, so I looked it up, and I was like, oh my gosh, this name sounds really familiar. Well, then I'll tell you more about this in a minute. Katrina Straub died from an accidental explosion, July 27, 1899. An article from the Macoka Excelsior dated July 29, 1899 relates the story this way. Mrs. Henry Straub died at her home in the eastern part of Macoka Township Tuesday after 2 weeks of terrible suffering. 2 weeks ago Saturday, her husband came to this city and got some medicine for a sick horse. It was necessary to boil the medicine before using it, and the next day he set about it. While it was boiling, it exploded, and he threw it out upon the ground, close enough to set fire to his wife's clothes. She was severely burned about the limbs and up as high as her waist. She lingered until Tuesday and passed away. Shortly before her death, she gave birth to a daughter. And at that time, the daughter was living. Funeral services are being held today, and internment will take place at Union Center. So looking up on Ancestry, I was having a problem finding this daughter, but when someone's still living, you can't access that information. I don't know. Is it possible? I mean, she couldn't still be living in 1899, so maybe somebody just hasn't changed it on their family tree. But her sister, that was born 2 years earlier, was my aunt. So Katrina Straub, was my great Aunt Caroline's mother. She married my grandma's brother. And so that's why I know this name. This was my aunt. So Katrina's father, the one that suffered the loss of his wife, was Ruth Castile's grandmother. And I think most of you knew Ruth Castile. So Caroline Marie Straub, my aunt, she was born in 1896, so she could not have been the one, that was born. So anyway, this accident is just so tragic. Preston Times headline: word was received here Friday of the killing of Mrs. Fred A. Pankow of Spragueville while taking clothes off the line about 2 o'clock. Though medical assistance was summoned as soon as possible, she died in about half an hour. There was a blinding flash and a terrific thunderclap, and Mr. Pankow was horrified to see his wife lying lifeless on the ground. She was just 19. Fred Pankow's wife was the daughter of John and Dora Geibelstein Becker. This was another tragedy for the Becker family, who had already suffered so many losses. John and Dora Becker lost their firstborn son, Charlie, at just 14 days old. Sons Mather died at 5 months, and Frank at 2 months. John's first wife died at age 22, and their child Augusta died at age 9. 5 years after the death of his wife Elizabeth, Frederick married Anna Augusta Gluckstead. They were the parents of 3 daughters. Only one lived to adulthood. Daughter Ophrah died at 2 months of age, and Babel at 6 months. Did anybody know the Pankow family, later generations? Frightful shooting accident at Sebula, 1918. Mrs. Fred White met a tragic death on the night of July 4th. The Sebula Gazette gives the following particulars of a frightful accident which cost the life of Mrs. Fred White. The most terrible and shocking accident in the history of the community occurred shortly before 8 o'clock. Thursday evening, when Mrs. Fred O. White was instantly killed by the accidental discharge of a shotgun being carried by her husband. As near as we can learn the facts, as told by the grief-stricken husband and daughter, who were the only witnesses to the sad affair, they are about as follows. Mr. and Mrs. White and their daughter, Dora, started from the house to go to the garden to pick some peas. They decided that on account of it being the 4th, they would take the gun out and fire a few salutes. Taking the automatic shotgun, the trio started down the lane for the garden, with Mrs. White walking a few feet ahead and a little to the left of Mr. White. The latter, of course, supposed the gun to be empty and had no idea that it carried a load, the shells he intended to use being in his pocket. It is thought that the button on the gun must have accidentally pressed against Mr. White's arm or body, and the discharge followed. The charge struck Mrs. White on the left side of the rear portion of her head away, death being instantaneous. The husband and daughter were very near crazy with horror and grief over the terrible accident when E.L. Smith happened by a minute or two later and found them. Neighbors and friends soon arrived and did everything possible under the circumstances to comfort the grieved family. Mrs. Fred White is buried in Evergreen Cemetery, Sebula, with her husband. Doris was their adopted daughter. Fred White married Olive Bernice Long in 1921. They did not have any children. 4 infant children of Adolph and Caroline Meyer are buried in Salem Lutheran Church, Spragueville. They include William, who died in 1891 at less than 1 year of age, and Henry died when he was also less than 1 year in 1896. Daughter Minnie died in 1901, and at 10 days old. 2 years later, son Elmer died before the age of 1. 2 children, Rosella and Walter, lived to adulthood. Does anybody know anything about those families, the 2 children that survived? And this was shared with me from Kathy Bailey. She said, oh, do you know about this one? And this one is really tragic. Dubuque Daily Times, June 22nd, 1870, headline, terrible casualty, 4 young men blown up by gunpowder. One of the young men killed, the others dangerously injured. In the long catalog of accidents which appear in the columns of the daily press, none are more sickening in details than those occasioned by the premature explosion of gunpowder, the quickness with which the awful event takes place, and the frightful mutilation which ensues can never be banished from memory. There is a terror about the very name that sends a thrill of horror to the heart, more deep and thrilling than that occasioned by any other species of accident. One of the most shocking accidents of the above nature that we have ever been called upon to record occurred at Tatey Moore, a few miles south of the city, last Sunday afternoon. The Catholic residents were holding a grand religious festival. The ceremonies consisting of a large procession composed of men, women, and children. The priest appeared before them, each of them, and bestowed his blessing, and at the conclusion, a large cannon was fired. The firing party was comprised of 4 young men, sons of farmers residing in that neighborhood. They ran out of powder and started with a fresh supply of 7 pounds. The young man carrying the powder was smoking. And he was smoking a cigar. When some of the powder spilled, he leaned over to put it back in the paper.
Oh.
And he was kind of joking around with his friends, and he went to speak, and the cigar fell from his mouth. The result was the most terrible explosion. The smoker was blown into the air and fell in a heap, so scorched, blackened, and disfigured that he was hardly recognizable. The rest of the party was shockingly injured, their skins being burnt to a crisp and peeling off. Every vestige of clothing was blown off, hair singed off, and their eyesight destroyed. And I don't know if maybe they did gain their eyesight back, because some of these men went on to marry, and had professions as farmers. Maybe you could farm as the blind man. I don't know. Added to the horrors, a large number of school children who happened to be standing near caught fire, and many were badly burned. One of the victims who died was the only son of a widow and was her only support. The unfortunate men injured were Anton Saylor, who died a few hours after. I'm still not sure who it was that actually, was the smoker. I'm not sure who the name on that. And I do think that some of these names are misspelled in the paper, so it made it really hard for me to trace back and find out who they are. Charles Tyson, Nick Werner, Nick Arndt, Nick Ahrens, and Peter Knapp, or Peter Kapp, I mean. Other than Werner, the other boys probably survived. Peter Kummer and a nun received injuries. Nicholas Guerin, I even have that turned off. Let's see. Nicholas Guerin and Nicholas Tyson, born in 1854, were victims. So on Find a Grave, I was able to find a Nicholas Ahrens, and he did die that same year. He was buried in St. Denis Catholic Cemetery, so he might have been, the one that was smoking. And then that same family suffered a tragedy because his brother died in White Lake, South Dakota, and they were fatally burned in a prairie fire that the Indians had started.
So
and they couldn't escape the flames.
What year was the gunpowder incident?
1870. And then I was able to find a Charles Tyson that was born in 1857 in St. Denis and died in 1935 in Nebraska. And so he may have been one of the ones that survived. Otherwise, had anyone ever heard of that tragedy before?
I haven't heard of that, but the Tysons are the St. Denis.
Right,
and
right.
And Bonnie Tyson is the curator of their museum and everything there.
So she probably would have some information.
And she does
about
all
that.
the tours.
And I knew the Tyson family, but some of those other names, they were just misspelled enough to where I'm not sure, A death of child caused by snakebite. Sometime in the 1800s, Mrs. John Teeple, who lived 8 miles west, lost a son, aged 11 and 2 months, from the effect of a rattlesnake bite. It appears the boy was in company of his mother and several others, picking blackberries when they were attracted by his screams. They found he had been bitten in the ankle. Every remedy was applied, but to no effect. He died after suffering greatly. And so would this be a relation to Pat?
Could well be. Yeah.
December 12, 1878. A most distressing casualty occurred at the flag station on the CCD&M Railroad called Lanesville, located about 4 miles north of Sebula. Several cold days had closed up the, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Is it slow or slough? How do you pronounce that? Slough. I was going to look that up, forgot to do that. In the rear of the station and near the shore, the coating of ice was quite thick and apparently safe. Mr. E.W. Lane was station agent at the place which bore his name. and on the date above mentioned, desiring to give a party of his family a pleasure ride, placing them on a large handheld sled on the ice, adjusted his skates, and pushed his precious load in front of him. After some time spent in this enjoyment, the party happened to cross a weak place in the ice, and all went into the water. The terrible struggles of this man to save his family are unknown, but his drowning shrieks attracted the attention of two strangers passing up the railroad track, which ran to his assistance. They passed a pole to the exhausted man. He grasped it, but was powerless to cling to it, and with a last heart-rending groan sank to the bottom of the slough. His wife and two children were drowned with him, leaving two other children to mourn a terrible loss. And I was thinking, you know, he had those skates on, so I don't know what the weight of the skates would have been. It made it harder for him to, you know, escape. So I found a private Edwin W. Lane that was born about 1837. So this could have been him. He was a native of New York, and he was a private with the 96th Illinois Infantry, and then later with the 121st during the Civil War. He was a farmer, and this gentleman's buried in Evergreen Cemetery, so that may be the man that died. Children of Peter and Sophia Peterson. German natives Peter and Sophia Peterson were married August 13, 1852 in Jackson County. To this union, 12 children were born. They lost 3 children in 1863, Maria 9, Sophia 7, and Anna 5. The next year, they would suffer the loss of Peter, age 4, and Dorothea, age 2. In 1868, they lost 9-month-old George. Baby Augusta died because her mother had milk fever, and the baby had to be fed cow's milk. She died at 5 months of age in 1880. And it gets worse. Emil died at age 13 in 1883. He stumbled and fell upon an open knife, which he held in his hand. The blade pierced the boy's neck and severed an artery. In 1894, Mabel, age 6, died of typhoid fever. The children are buried in Canada Hollow, Miles, Iowa. Only 4 of the 12 Peterson children lived to adulthood. The first well the Petersons had used was an old dug well. The children got sick with typhoid fever. The doctor prescribed medicine, but the drugstore would not extend credit. They may have mortgaged the land for the medicine. So I know that Mabel, she died from typhoid. I'm not sure, you know, if those other children that died, if that was from typhoid or from something else. Okay, so then this one, this is the one that I came across, and it just, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. John and his wife, Anne Sykes Holroyd, were born in England and married there on August 28, 1825. The couple came to Iowa in about 1837. The Holroyds were one of the first settlers of Van Buren Township in Jackson County. John Holroyd held different supervisor positions and is mentioned several times in the history of Jackson County. And in all of the history books that we have here, there's no mention of what I'm about to tell you. They were the parents of 10 children altogether. Oliver, 14, Charles, 12, Ruth, 10, Theophilus, 8, Dan, 6, Francis, 2, and Rachel, 1. These 7 children who were born in England all died on the same day in 1840. The children of John and Anne Holroyd were among those killed on the steamboat Persian in 1840. A nephew also perished. The children were on their way to rejoin their parents who were returning from England to Preston, their new home and country. The children are buried in St. Joseph Catholic Cemetery in Preston. In 1841, Abraham Holroyd was born, so a year after they lost all their children. And then daughter Harriet was born 4 years later. In 1848, John settled on 160 acres of land in Jackson County. A few years later, he would purchase more land. In 1850, their 18-year-old son, Abraham, died of pneumonia, 10 years after the death of his 7 siblings. Another child, Noah Sykes Holroyd, drowned in the Mississippi River in 1853. He was 18 years old. The steamboat Persian suffered a deadly boiler explosion on the Mississippi River near Napoleon, Desha County, costing the lives of 30 passengers and crew members. The Holroyd children were passengers on this steamboat. On the night of November 7, 1840, the Persian stopped near Napoleon to take on wood to fire its boilers. The vessel was about 3 miles below Napoleon when a boiler flue collapsed, releasing scalding steam and water that killed 6 people instantly and left dozens of others with dreadful injuries. The ship's captain described it as one of the best men of his vocation on the Western water, was asleep at the time of the accident. Several of the Persian's firemen claimed that the pilot was drunk. A passenger on another vessel that overtook the Persian after the explosion described the scene. The sight we witnessed on boarding the fated boat was the most awful and distressing I ever beheld. The large and spacious cabin of the Persian was covered with sufferers, and those beyond the pangs of pain, men, women, and children of all ages. Many of them were entirely stripped of skin, and some of the flesh from their bones. 17 other crew members and deck passengers died the following day, and the others died from their injuries in the days that followed. The ultimate death toll of the Persian disaster is believed to be 30 people, including 2 young men who leapt from the deck of the doomed steamboat and drowned in the Mississippi. So I was unable to find a picture of the Persian, shown as the Sultana, and that exploded in 1865 on the Mississippi River. And an estimated 1,547 people were killed, mostly Union soldiers, returning home after the war. The Persian. One newspaper stated that we believe the Persian, the Renzi, and the United States were engaged in racing. The result is known, and 30 innocent persons must have been hurried without a moment's warning into the presence of their maker. A more likely scenario, given the solid reputation of the Persian's captain, came from the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, which reported that the boat had stopped at a woodpile a short time before the collapse, but no steam was let off. To a surcharge of steam, the catastrophe is attributed. The Persian catastrophe illustrates the dangers of steamboat travel in the 19th century. Those who have been killed and wounded were deck passengers and some of the crew. The whole of the cabin passengers and the captain and clerk escaped uninjured. The head engineer was killed. The clerk of the steamboat, Meteor, informs us that the persons killed were the first engineer, the second mate, 2 firemen, and it says 6 deck passengers, which is incorrect because it should have been more with the children. Although it says 4 deck passengers are missing and 24 of them were badly scalded. And the fact that the Holroyds were on deck may have had something to do with economic factors. So you could buy passage on a boat and just be on the deck rather than having your own cabin to sleep in. Quote from Wicked River by Lee Sandlin. I don't know if anybody's read that book, but I would recommend it. The rise of the steamboats wrecked the old river etiquette. There had always been a logic to the traffic flow. The downriver traffic ran in channels, while the upriver traffic stuck to the shallows. The steamboats put an end to all of that. They cut in and out of channels, no matter which direction they were traveling. They were indifferent to the chaos they could leave in their wake. If 2 steamboats came around a bend and spotted a wood yard ahead, they'd tear up river together to see who would get there first, much to the exhilaration and terror of the passengers, and much to their ultimate horror if an overtaxed boiler blew before the finish line. So Harriet, she was the only surviving child, And she married DeBillo Sweet, and they were the parents of 2 children. Her mother, Ann Holroyd, lived with her daughter and family in Van Buren Township after the death of her husband. DeBillo Sweet lost both of his brothers in the Civil War. Delos Sweet died of wounds June 15, 1863 in Memphis, and brother Menzo Sweet was 18 years old, and he was killed in battle at Vicksburg on June 4th. So I found this letter that Harriet had written, and it just kind of amazed me after, everything that her father had gone through. Just what a remarkable man, he was. So in the history, the Jackson County, the Ellis book, appears this letter that's written by Harriet. Dear Sir, in the Sebula Gazette of this day, I notice you appeal to pioneers of Jackson County. I am much interested in the history of Jackson County, having lived there for 44 years. And when your book is completed, we'll be anxious to read it. In 1876, Fairfield Township held a 4th of July celebration in a grove a little southwest of the B.F. Hull home. And one of the items of that day's program was a little history of the township, written by 3 of the oldest settlers, 2 of whom were residents before it was organized, William E. Reed and my father, John Holroyd. This bit of history was printed in the Sebula Gazette in 1876 and reprinted in the same paper 3 or 4 years ago. I have the clipping with me, but there is nothing to indicate the date of this last printing. My father came from England and settled in Fairfield Township in 1840, and neighbors were so few and far between that my mother was at one time 3 months without seeing a white woman. A few squaws were among the Indians who roamed over the country and sometimes stopped at the house. An incident of my early days, which impressed my child mind very much, was the coming on horseback one Sunday of 2 women who were in great distress because they feared their homestead claims were going to be taken from them by claim jumpers, as they were called, unscrupulous people coming from the east who entered land regardless of the right of settlers. Both of these ladies were widows with families and, of course, poor in financial sense, as nearly all the settlers were, and they had come to see if Father could help them secure at least the 40 or 80 on which their log cabin stood. I don't know how much money they lacked, but I do know that Father went to the neighbors and borrowed all he could and started for Dubuque that same evening, as to be at the land office when the doors were opened on Monday morning. He was on time, and the widows' homes were safe to them. I think the reason of the strong impression to them was that Father, who would never do work or business on Sunday, should go borrow money and go off to Dubuque on Sunday. Respectfully, Harriet Holroyd Sweet. Maybe he should be in the Hall of Fame too.
I think so.
Kyle Davis drowning. Kyle Davis, a well-known citizen of Maquoketa, was drowned in the Maquoketa River near the Goddard Dam on the afternoon of July 4th while bathing. And if you notice, a lot of these are on July 4th, these terrible things that happened. It is said he sank to a watery grave without a struggle, and his death may have been the result of a heart attack. Mr. Davis leaves a family who has a heartfelt sympathy of the community. One of the daughters was in attendance in Bellevue when the accident took place.
What year was that?
1918. Mr. Davis conducted a creamery in Maquoketa. Do we know anything about that? Okay. And was highly esteemed by all who knew him. John Kyle Davis, or Kyle John Davis, died July 4th, 1918, at the age of 49. Father of Harry and Portia and another daughter. Portia would have been about 16 when her father died, and then she died just 2 years later. She was the youngest daughter of the Davises. She was in the class of 1919 and a member of the Congregational Church. And then the other sister was Mrs. Harry Worth of Elwood. John's wife, Mary Ellen Davis, she remarried at age 56 to Emery L. Hinckley, So would that have been Hinckley Drugstore?
The father of.
John and Friederike Beck were married in Germany, February 14, 1867. They were the parents of 7 children. In 1880, they lost an infant child, and in 1887, 3 sons drowned. Conrad, 14, Jacob, 12, and Christoph, 6. The account of the drowning was reported as follows. 5 boys drowned while bathing in the Macoka River in Iowa on June 7, 1887. 5 boys, three of whom were sons of John Beck, and 2 of them sons of Paul Hindle, whose ages ranged from 9 to 16, were drowned in the Maquoketa, 7 miles east of here yesterday. 3 of them, while swimming, plunged off a sandbar into the water beyond their depth. When another boy saw they were drowning, he plunged in to rescue them. Another boy who had his clothes on, noticing the failure of the first boy, also plunged in, and all were drowned together. Another boy, being by this time undressed, plunged in after them, but he wasn't able to rescue any of them, and they did not recover any of the bodies. Children of James and Hattie Burns are buried in Preston Cemetery. Harry Burns died at age 2 in 1874. Twins Nellie and Robbie died in 1880 at less than a year old. Hattie died at about age 5 in 1884. 2 of their children lived to adulthood, George and Mabel. Does anyone know that family at all? Sarah Jane O'Neill was born in Spragueville, daughter of Ireland natives, on August 24, 1870. She died in 1944. She married Stephen Monroe Andrew in Spragueville in 1885. Sarah and Stephen were the parents of 8 children. She is buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. And so I really got interested in this story when I read her obituary. And I learned that at the time she died, she had 6 grandsons who were in the service, and 2 of them were being held as POWs. Grandson Leroy Slatt was stationed in New Guinea. Grandson Corporal Leonard Hardin was serving in France. Verd Stevenson was a private stationed at Pine Camp in New York. Max was a private serving at Camp Forest, Tennessee. Grandson Fred Moffett was being held prisoner by the Japanese in the Philippines. Private Frank Andrews was being held a prisoner in Germany. So of course I was curious as to, these POWs and if they did survive, and I'll tell you more about them. So during her lifetime, Sarah lost granddaughters Mildred, 21, Catherine, 10 months, grandsons Ralph, 1.5 years old, and Merle, age 3. She also suffered the loss of her son who was murdered. Oh, yeah, okay. And so then there were other losses, but after she died. So Sarah's son Frank was born September 8, 1891. He was an auto salesman who was murdered by a woman yielding a butcher knife. He left behind a widow and 5 children. They had lost 1 child in infancy. Mary Herman was charged with killing Frank Andrews during a lover's quarrel at Reardley's Island. And this would be near the Quad Cities, so it's not this county. But a jury found her guilty on January 20th. Sentencing, she was sentenced to 1 year in prison. Somehow that just seems not right. And fined, get this, $1,000. She filed a motion on the discharge of the fine. So Rock Island, Illinois article, Frank Andrews, auto salesman, is dead, and Mrs. Mary Herman is held without bail on a charge of slashing him to death with a butcher knife at a cabin on the island in Rock River. Mrs. Herman flatly denies murder on the stand and lays guilt of crime upon Weirick. refuting every charge made against her and reiterating her defense that Emma Rearick is the actual slayer of Frank Andrews, for whose murder she is on trial for. Frank Andrews, Sarah's grandson, was born July 3rd, 1922. At just 2 years of age, he was the one that lost his father to murder. He was raised by his mother, Bessie, and grew up dirt poor during the Great Depression, with his brothers Kenneth, Max, and sisters Marguerite and Dorothy. And he married Sarah Jane Crippen. He met her at a roller skating rink. Frank's wife was pregnant with her first child, Gary, when Frank was sent to war and when he was taken prisoner. Some accounts say he was a prisoner of war in Germany, and other accounts say Italy. Maybe he was a prisoner twice, I don't know. Frank survived the war and he passed away in 2015. Dorothy Andrews, Frank's sister, married Harry Bernard, and they were the parents of 3 children, and the youngest died as an infant. But by then, Sarah had died, and so she did not have to suffer a loss of another grandchild. So the one son then that died as a prisoner of war, just a little bit fascinated about this horrific story, but Fred Moffett was the son of Sarah's daughter, Myrtle. Fred grew up in the Quad Cities. Moffett was a prisoner of war being held by the Japanese in the Philippines and was later killed in what is known as the Palawan Massacre. Somebody heard of that massacre before? Only 11 men escaped the slaughter, and between 133 and 141 were killed. The site of the massacre can still be visited. The massacre is the premise of the published book, Last Man Out, Glenn McDowell, USMC's survivor of the Palawan Massacre in World War II, by Bob Littlebanks, and the opening scenes of the 2005 Miramax movie, The Great Raid. McDowell, who spent nearly 3 years as a prisoner of war, was awarded 13 medals, including the Bronze Star and Purple Heart, and this was after his death, and U.S. Senator Joni Ernst presented those medals to his daughter in Ankeny. So he escaped the massacre, and he was later a key witness in the war crime trials of 1945. A little bit more about this massacre. On August 12, 1942, 300 American prisoners arrived on 2 transport ships, survivors of the Battle of Bataan and the Battle of Corregidor. And they were interned in the old Philippine Constabulary Barracks, referred to as Palawan's Prison Camp, 10A, or Palawan Barracks. They would spend the next 2 years clearing out an area 2,400 by 225, and then building an 8-inch thick concrete runway using only hand tools. So this is Sarah's grandson that's doing all of this. Wheelbarrows they had to use and 2 small cement mixers, so it's quite labor intensive to do that. The prisoners were also forced to build rudiments for 150 Japanese planes. Sick and useless prisoners were switched with healthier ones out of Manila during construction. And then by 2 years later, half of those prisoners were sent back to Manila. October 1944, the airstrip and nearby harbor came under Allied attack. The prisoners were forced to dig bomb shelters within the prison compound, consisting of trenches 5 feet deep and 4 feet wide. Shelter A held 50 men, B 35, and C 30. And then there were other smaller 2 to 3 men shelters. Beatings were common, and rations eventually reduced to a mess kit of rice per day, 1 rice kit per day. There were 4 prison escape attempts. The first 2 were partially successful, but the 3rd and 4th were not. During World War II, on December 14, 1944, in order to prevent the rescue of these prisoners by the advancing Allies, the Japanese herded the remaining 150 POWs into 3 covered trenches and set them on fire using barrels of gasoline, and then fired shots into the entrances so that the dead and dying would trap the other POWs inside. As prisoners tried to escape the flames, they were shot down. Some escaped by going over a cliff that ran along one side of the trenches, but were later hunted down and killed. Only 11 men escaped the slaughter, and between, I guess I mentioned before, 133 and 141 were killed, including, and I'm assuming Sarah's grandson died, at that time, but I guess he could have died earlier. U.S. Army personnel identified the charred remains of the Americans captured at Bataan and Corregidor and burned alive on March 1945. And shown is a photo of the burial site. And the photo on right was taken by Bob Meza of the U.S. Navy in 1945. 1898, deadly tornado. The most terrible and deadly work done by the tornado was at the old Oliver Lowry farm, occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Charles Flory. And I think I've told about this one before when I did the storms. The Florys and their entire family, including a 3-year-old and 2-year-old twins, were killed. Scarcely a trace of any of the buildings remained, and practically everything movable about the premise had disappeared. The mother and one of the babies were found close together. Another baby was found in Dalton Creek, a quarter-mile east of the house. He was tangled in barbed wire that had formerly been a fence. The remains of all were brought to Preston, where kind and loving friends prepared them for burial. Another sad scene occurred at the home of Mike Maloney. 2 children, John and Mary, were instantly killed, and another child so badly injured that recovery was doubtful. Every building on the place was swept away, and much of the stock carried with them. On another farm, M.J. Hines, who was working in a barn at the time, was instantly killed. The terror of the situation was such that it was beyond description, and none but those who witnessed it can form the slightest idea of the results. It will be years before the community entirely recovers from the blow, and a generation will pass before the last vestige disappears. Florence Heights, April 17th, this is in New Jersey. While a party of 12 of the inmates of Dr. Thrale's hygienic institution at this place were out sailing, Saturday afternoon the boat capsized, drowning Mrs. Miller and daughter of Maquoketa. Jackson Sentinel, April 20th, 1876. Mr. Miller of this city received a dispatch informing him of the death by drowning of his wife and daughter Inez. They were at a water cure near Philadelphia. So the New York Hydropathic and Physiological School was founded by Russell Thatcher in 1853 in New York City. And it was hydropathic and medical school known for its natural therapies, vegetarianism. I think it was kind of before its time, some of the stuff that they really emphasized, sanitation and hygiene and exercise and all of that stuff, and they didn't do so much with drugs, with medicine like we do today. And part of the therapy involved the use of water for pain relief and treatment. And it was also used to treat symptoms of certain diseases. And it also was used to treat people with mental illness in the 19th and 20th centuries. These families all seem to be from Preston or Spragueville, but the Pankow family. Christian August Pankow was born July 20th, 1900, a member of a very prominent Spragueville family. He was himself a highly respected member of the community. He attended the Spragueville Schoolhouse and went to Preston High School, graduating in 1917. He enlisted with the Army in July of 1918 while just 17 years old, serving as a private with the 355th Mobile Laundry Unit during World War I. After his discharge, he took a position at a bank in Aurelia, Iowa, where he stayed for 2 years. In Aurelia, he was instrumental in organizing the Grasshoff McManus Legion Post 390. On June 5, 1921, he was married in Aurelia, Iowa, to Miss Gladys Shank. That same year, he came home to take the position of cashier at the Farmers Savings Bank of Spragueville. Early on the morning of June 30th, 1932, Chris Pankow walked to the bank, which was across the street from his home. He entered the basement of the building, put a revolver to his neck, and pulled the trigger. His obituary read, reflecting the high esteem in which he was held in Spragueville, Jackson County, and the state of Iowa, over 2,000 mourners gathered for the funeral of C.A. Pankow in 1932. And at first, there were quite a few people maybe that were really angry with him. And then later, I think that wasn't the case. His suicide shocked the community and the state. Will Kundle, a Maquoketa photographer, recorded the event with a series of 10 photographs. And that was the last one, and then this one. If I just could show you those two. Pankow's funeral, the day after C.A. Pankow's funeral, officers in the bank began auditing his duties and papers so as to be ready for business. They discovered that he had been playing a great deal with the figures in the books. He was essentially embezzling money in great amounts, but it wasn't for him. When the Great Depression hit, many people began to have big problems paying their loans and mortgages, and at first, Pankow helped them with his own money. He would make the payments for the people who asked for more time, thinking that he could recoup his money when the payments were made, and thereby preserving the people's credit rating and reputation. As time went on, his personal funds became quite insufficient, so he took a bit from those who could afford it, still believing that in the end, all notes would be brought up to date and that no one would lose any money nor anything else. In 1932, he realized that his plan was not only going to be unsuccessful, but that the whole situation was about to blow up in his face. The money he had borrowed would never be able to be repaid, and he had borrowed too much. Everyone was going to lose what for each of them would be a great deal of money. The bank examiners eagerly traced all the money transactions as Pankow kept detailed records, supporting the fact that he had always intended to repay all the money. They issued a list of what had been borrowed, from whom and whom the money had gone to help. Some people from whom money had been borrowed went to see the people who had been given the money and demanded repayment, sometimes instantly. Of course, the people didn't have the money, so heated arguments and fights broke out. Bank officials asked people to be patient, noting very publicly that the people who had been helped by Pankow had not had any idea what he had been doing, as he had always indicated that it would be a private matter between them. Depositors were urged to work through the bank and not privately. Eventually, many private arrangements were made to settle things. Many borrowers went to the lenders wanting to repay the money. No one was looking for a gift or to do anyone out of anything. Many loans were forgiven by the bank at the request of the people whose funds were borrowed from. Some who had the money settled the accounts for friends and family. Other people voluntarily sold their property and goods to settle their accounts. The people who had asked for more time to make payments felt that they had been responsible for what had happened. Although at one time, none of them had realized that they had been just one of a growing number of people asking Mr. Pankow for the same thing. Many felt guilty about his suicide. Those stated that if he had come to them, they would have settled their accounts as best they could. In the end, the citizens of Spragueville knew that they could not lose their bank and banded together to save it, and this is what they did. Also, regard for C.A. Pankow was restored after people thought about the reasons he had done what he did, which was to help the community. C.A. Pankow was the nephew of Frederick Pankow that I mentioned earlier, who lost his wife, hit by lightning. Okay, so we get to the last one. This one does have a happy ending. I want to end with this. So it would be absolutely the worst tragedy for any family when a child goes missing. And so this is what happened with this story. And again, maybe this is
Pat's.
Pat. So this would
Pat
be
Gent.
Pat Gent's family this happened to. So, okay, so would it be the daughter though? Well, yes. But somehow it's related to Pat Gent. Luther Teeple's daughter was lost for 8 years. Headlines: Truth is Stranger Than Fiction, and Adventure of a Little One. In 1850, Mrs. Luther Teeple of Jackson County started on a visit to relatives in Canada. She took her little daughter, some 8 or more years old. As they were passing along in the crowded streets of Chicago, the little girl lost sight of her mother, a circumstance which was unnoticed for a moment. As soon as Mrs. Teeple discovered the absence of her little one, she retraced her steps. But the child had mingled with the crowd and was nowhere to be found. Streets were searched, the police were notified, and every effort was made to discover the lost child, but in vain. The broken-hearted mother proceeded to Canada without her little one, writing to her husband to come to Chicago and continue the search, which he did for some time, advertising the lost child in the papers. He returned home without his daughter. 6 years went by, and hope had given place to despair, given probability that the child was dead. One day in April 1856, Mr. Teeple and family were astonished by the appearance of a bright-eyed youth in boy's clothing, appearing at their door and calling out, "Father!" He was much surprised, not recognizing the little stranger, who proved to be his long-lost daughter, who had made her escape in this disguise. The child's story was that when she became lost from her mother, she hurried along the street to catch up with her, but she was probably at every moment becoming farther and farther behind. In the evening, she was taken by a policeman to the asylum. Now this always kind of surprises me. You know, they take her to the asylum. They had to have read the papers. You know, I just don't know why that kept happening, kept taking people to asylums. So she was taken to the asylum for orphans, where she was kept for 3 years. Then she was bound out to some family by whom she was ill-treated. Some kind-hearted neighbor, learning of her troubles and what she could remember of her history, determined if possible to help return her to her parents. She could remember Bellevue, and that her father's home was within a day's drive. Of course, she had not forgotten her parents' names. With this her newfound friends disguised her in boy's clothing to assist her in making her escape, and furnished the necessary means to send her to Bellevue, where she would probably learn the whereabouts of her parents. When she arrived there, she was directed to Judge D.F. Spur, who at that time was the county judge, and who at once provided her with a conveyance and thus restored her to the arms of her parents. Alice Finlove Teeple, married twice, had 6 children, and is buried in the Canton Cemetery, Jones County. She was born in 1844 and died in 1916 at the age of 72. Her second husband, Edwin Lowe, served with the Iowa 26th Infantry. Does anyone want to share anything from any of those stories that you have anything to add to them? Early?
Yeah, my brother, he was shot by M9 back in 1967, and he was in a Jeep with his brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law's gun went off in the Jeep and ricocheted and struck him in the chest, and he died a few hours later. This was in 1967.
And that was an accidental shooting.
Yeah.
Sorry to hear that. Anyone else?
The whole rattlesnake thing I know is true too, because not that particular one necessarily, but my husband said when his older brother was little, and Mike's 5 years older than Mark, so they lived out in the country, and that's how they ended up moving into town, because Darlene had to go out and check the yard for snakes before she let them play out there. They were rattlesnakes. It was near the cave somewhere, I think they lived, but then they moved into town for a long time because she couldn't deal with it out in the country.
The rocky areas, that's kind of the worst.
And that wasn't uncommon with the rattlesnakes, because I had a second cousin, it was probably, they say, I think it was like 1941, then they fought, and they were at a baby shower, and she was 4 years old, running around outside near Lamont, and she got bit by a rattlesnake.
Did she survive?
No, she did not. She was, well, their first child. But yeah, so it wasn't uncommon.
No, I think there probably were a lot of.
Depending on where you live. And another thing, the tornado in 1898, and that's right, that family lived like across from where Max McNeil lives now.
Okay.
And our family farm is like a mile east. And my grandmother grew up where my brother had lived, and it was up on a hill, and the next morning, she was like 7 years old, and she said there was a child's handkerchief in the lawn that had blown there, and she saved that. I think my sister still has that.
Oh, wow.
But nothing was touched on their farm, and they lived up on a hill. But she told me about all the things that happened to that thing. But that's about where it was, and I think the McNeils own that land now.
Early?
Yeah, I had a sister that was murdered in Wichita, Kansas in 1987, and so.
So your family suffered quite a bit there with
Yeah.
those two. Jeez. And of course, there are so many tragedies in recent years, in our county, and I just didn't feel it's appropriate maybe to bring, any of the more recent ones up, that, family members are still dealing with that. And so hopefully these have been long ago, that, I just kind of felt their stories needed to be told and what they went through.
I'd seen that Polaroid tombstone years ago, and I've always wondered what happened,
With the
how that happened.
The
that they all
7 children that
Yeah.
died? I know, that's what I kind of wondered too. And, but there's just no mention. I'm just surprised there's no mention. Maybe it was just too difficult to talk about. And, I just would even thought Harriet Holroyd would have put that in her letter,
Right.
Yeah.
Embarrassing.
Okay, thank you.